My name is Ronnie Green, and I have the privilege and pleasure of serving here as the Vice Chancellor for the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome to this afternoon's Heuermann Lecture. This is our second Heuermann Lecture of the current academic year, and we're very pleased today to welcome to our campus Catherine Bertini. So we're in for a great treat this afternoon. The Heuermann Lectures are a new program, relatively new. We're in our second year of the lecture series. Started last academic year due to the generosity of a gift from Keith and Norma Heuermann, longtime supporters of agriculture and of the University of Nebraska here in the state. We're very pleased today to have Keith with us here as our guest. Keith, thank you so much for you and Norma's generosity. Don't know what happened. There we go. The purpose of the Heuermann Lectures is to bring people to our campus from the global stage to really talk about food security, about natural resource security, about rural community and landscape security, some of the greatest challenges that are facing our planet as we move into the next part of our history. And we've been very fortunate in our past lectures to have a number of very esteemed guests in our lecture series. Our most recent, in late September, was a panel discussion of 4 former U.S. Secretaries of Agriculture as we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act this year here on our campus. All of these lectures, I would draw your attention to the fact that they're archived. They are available on the web. If you've not been able to participate in the past lectures or may miss one of our future lectures, you can go to the humanlectures.unl.edu website to see those and take those in yourself. We're also very pleased that these are web streamed and that they're aired on NET at later dates. So we have people joining us in the lecture today through that mechanism, and we appreciate that opportunity as well. We have several guests with us that I'd like to introduce before we bring Kathy up to speak. We're pleased today to have Lieutenant Governor Rick Sheehy with us from our state government. Rick, thank you for being here. Chancellor Harvey Perlman, our Chancellor here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Greg Ibaugh, the Director of the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. Greg, we're pleased to have you here today. And I'm very pleased that the entire board, I think, of the Nebraska Farm Bureau Federation is here with us today. Their board meeting is occurring here in Lincoln today, and they heard about Catherine being with us, and they're here. So we're very pleased, Steve, to have you and your board joining us from the Nebraska Farm Bureau. We are so pleased to have Catherine Bertini come to UNL today to deliver this lecture entitled Where America Must Lead, Ensuring the World Can Feed Its People. Catherine is a woman with tremendous expertise in feeding people, as you'll hear in her presentation, and avoiding starvation in times of famine, war, weather disasters, and other catastrophes. She is a professor of public administration and international relations at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University in New York. She is a leader in public sector management, international organizations, humanitarian relief, agricultural development, gender programming, and nutrition policy. She is currently co-chair of the Global Agricultural Development Initiative of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, chair of its Girls and Rural Economies Initiative, and co-chair of its U.S. Agriculture and Food Policy. For 2 years, she was a senior fellow in agricultural development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She was the driving force behind reform of the United Nations World Food Program when she served 10 years as the World Food Program's chief executive. She was honored as a World Food Prize laureate, the Nobel Prize for Agriculture as we think of it globally, in 2003 for her leadership there at the UN in decreasing world hunger. Institutional changes under Kathy's leadership were cited by the U.S. government and the UN World Food Program's 36 government board as models of UN reform and placed the food agency in the forefront of international agencies in efficiency, effectiveness, accountability, and income. I think you can see from this brief glimpse, and it's only a part of a glimpse of her professional career and the impact that she has made through her career. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Bertini as our Human lecturer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. Thank you for that warm Nebraska welcome. It is an honor to be at such a world-class institution and one that is so critically important, not only in your state, but in fact for our entire country and for the world, especially based on the research and the work that you do in agriculture. I've heard about Nebraska so often from others in my life, most notably Clayton Yider, for whom I worked at USDA when he was secretary and I was assistant secretary in charge of food and consumer services. And then more recently from Jeff Rakes, for whom I worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And their love for the university and of the state is magnified many times over, I think, every time they talk about it, and is really very, very exciting to hear. So I thank you for the chance to actually be here, to tour the campus, and to learn more about all the work that you do firsthand. Also, I want to acknowledge all of the very prominent people that are here, the Lieutenant Governor, the Chancellor, the President Emeritus, the head of Agriculture for the state, the Farm Bureau, and many others. So thank you, and thank you all for coming today. And before I begin, I have to thank Mr. and Mrs. Huerman and for your generosity in creating this series and in inviting me here today. And it is this kind of work that people like you do that make a huge difference in the fabric of community life. The fact that we can have interchanges with the university and with people coming in and out like me is extremely important. And I salute you for this initiative that you have taken. And I greet you from Clayton Yider, who told me a fact that I don't know how well known here it is, that he and you were fraternity brothers. He's very proud of that and of your friendship, so thank you very much. Where America must lead, ensuring that the world can feed its people. This message is one of the most important messages to give today, tomorrow, and in the years and months ahead, as we think about the positioning of the United States of America in the world, but also, most importantly, as we think about the state of the world as it relates to feeding and hunger and poverty and the possibilities that individuals have. So today I'd like to talk about that, and I'd like to do so in several general topics, talking about the challenges that exist, some of the consequences if there's no action, some of the solutions, in fact, the most important solutions that I will propose, current efforts that are underway, and then how can we reach that goal? What should our vision be? How do we rise to that purpose? When we think about, first and foremost, the challenges The population of the world, according to the UN, is expected to increase from currently about 7 billion people to 9 billion people by 2050. And the continent that will have the highest rate of population growth is Africa, where the population is expected to double by 2050 to 2 billion people. This is a UN chart that just shows, if you look at the relative size, first of all, of the circles in terms of the relative size of the growth of population from 1950 until the projections for 2050. And most importantly, I think, is to take a look on this slide at the colors for Europe and the colors for Africa. Many of the other sections are relatively similar, but as you can see, the dark red, the kind of burgundy color, that's Europe. And you can see the relative size of the European population in the world in 1950, and then compare it to the projection for 2050, where it's considerably smaller. At the same time, if you look at the colors for Africa, the light green color, you can see a relatively small size, in fact smaller than Europe in 1950, and then look at the numbers for 2050 in terms of the African statistics. And if I can go even a bit further and ask you to follow the European line of the numbers, if you can see these numbers from where you sit, and I'm going to walk in front of this for a moment. But if we look at the numbers, for instance, for 2010 in Europe, we're looking at 732 million people, and then look at for 2025, where it's 729, it's less. In 2050, it's 691, it's less. Now, I'm not saying this to pick on Europe. I'm saying this, and I'll make this point later in my presentation as well. We have to think differently about where our markets might be in the future, and we have to think differently about where the people are going to be. Certainly, the Asia growth is obvious, and Asia markets are important for us. But the markets are going to be very different in the future, and Africa potentially would be a much more important market, with especially an increase of virtually 100% projected. When we think another piece of the challenge about the rising food demand is not just population, but it's also rising incomes. This is the good news story. The good news is that with people, whether in India or China or anywhere else, increase their incomes, then they want better food. And as they want better food, they want more protein, they want more variety. That means they want more beef, they want more chicken. It graduates and it multiplies the need for additional food, which goes beyond even the numbers of people that exist in the world. So the good news is much of the population is having increased income, and but that means that there are also increases as well in the need for food. And then another point that's not often discussed in this context, but think about the increase in obesity rates, not only what we see in North America, but actually throughout the world. And that adds to food consumption needs. It also, unfortunately, adds to health challenges that the world has as well. There's one researcher named Ricardo Ude who does a whole presentation on this matter. He's based out of London, and he shows pictures, for instance, of a woman and her child from the developing world, and the woman is overweight and the child is emaciated, and they're both eating the same thing, but he's making the point that it's not the right thing. So it's helping to make her, with her metabolism, obese, and it's not helping him, the child, to be able to develop as he should. So this is another issue to put on the table when we think about demand. And the Food and Agriculture Organization says that 870 million people now are desperately hungry every day. That these are people who absolutely don't have enough food every day. It's not because they're cut off from food from a war or natural disaster. It's because they're cut off from food because of their dire poverty. And they just do not have enough even to feed themselves for the day. There's also an estimate that 1.3 billion people are living in poverty with incomes of less than $1, the equivalent of $1.25 a day. These people are also desperately hungry, not quite as desperately hungry as the 870, if you can imagine. But what's also interesting about where these people live is that most of them live in rural areas, and that women and children are the most vulnerable. Well, we know this is true in any country. It's true in our society, where the poorest of the poor in the US are often female-headed households. This is certainly, again, multiplied many times over when the poverty is actually so much worse in the developing world. Because most of the majority of the poor are located in rural areas, of course, makes it even more important that we think about agricultural opportunities for those people, because how else are they going to be able to work their way out of their hunger and out of their poverty? And the answer shouldn't be go to the city where there'll be another a person in overcrowded cities where there are many poor, but much of the answer needs to be developing the economies and their ability to grow in their own rural areas. Then there's the land scarcity issue, and this doesn't even touch on the issue of land ownership so much as just the availability of land. And only 12% of the world's arable land remains uncultivated. And of course, we've heard about large-scale land acquisitions from some countries who then export the food directly to their own country rather than having it be something that's part of the economic development of that particular country. And then there's an increased competition, of course, for land for other uses. We know and see that here, for instance, using food for fuel. We see in many areas stagnant yields. The Green Revolution that started with the great work of Dr. Norman Borlaug has boosted productivity in many regions, but some regions like Africa did not benefit. And productivity has stagnated in some years. In fact, in Africa, the productivity is the lowest. They use the highest amounts of labor and the lowest inputs. This is a chart showing fertilizer, for instance, and these are FAO data, and although the figures are old, they still make a point. In each case, the region is on the bottom of the chart, and there are two lines that are referring to that region. So in East Asia, the first one, between 61 and 63, you can see the level of fertilizer available. And then you can see when they again counted in 97 to 99, how much more fertilizer was being used in Asia. Next, industrialized countries, South Asia, Near East and North Africa, which is more really the Middle East region, Latin America and the Caribbean, transition countries, but then we get to Africa. Barely a blip on the map before and still now. And then if we look at agricultural output, and this is a very current slide from Global Harvest, which if you look at the darkest countries and regions, those are where the annual agriculture growth has been over 3% since the mid-1990s. So very current statistics, very telling story about where agriculture is growing dramatically. And the one country in Africa, which is dark green, is Angola. And a lot of that growth has been after the Civil War finally ended and the country could get back to its agricultural base. But you can see that there's some good news here too, because there are quite a few countries that are in bright green, which is that their increase was between 1% and 3%, at least anyway, moving in a positive direction. And therefore, I think showing a fair amount of potential. The brown is the under 1% growth. So in total, when we think about the needs for 2050, we're talking about an additional increase of 60% over a current agriculture production that we need to meet new demand. Now, I said to some people earlier today, sometimes you hear the statement, We grow enough food in the world right now to feed every woman, man, and child in the world today. Yes, that may be true, but how are we going to split it up? We're going to take the whole pot of food and then somehow divide it by the number of people and say, okay, here's your food. It doesn't work that way. There's so many access issues, and most of them are related to poverty and people's ability to be able to access that food. So we need to increase the production, but we also need to be sure that, that people have access to it. So thinking about some of the consequences that, that can occur, or actually some of the other actions that occur that further impact these issues. One is price volatility, and you've seen that firsthand, and imagine a smallholder farmer, a poor farmer, who's in an even more precarious position than many of the farmers in Nebraska and elsewhere around the country. And where increases in the price doesn't necessarily affect them as much as it could, because it's also increasing all of their inputs and everything else, and they might, and actually even though the increase at the market is quite large, they may not be the ones that are benefiting those. That's exacerbated by weather patterns, I'll get to that in a minute, by trade policies, which sometimes cause more uncertainty. You may have read that during the, in 2008, when the food prices went up so high, many countries started limiting their exports, essentially hoarding the food, and saying no food can go out of our country. But that ends up having very negative impacts on the overall international trade picture and on the ability of other countries to be able to feed themselves as well, and actually becomes very counterproductive. We know in this country and in any country that when food prices rise, poor people have an even harder time being able to get enough food, because so much of the household budget of a poor person, again, in any country in the world, goes to food, and if the food prices increase, of course, it puts even more pressure on those folks. Climate change is another issue, and high temperatures in drought areas increase variability, stress water resources. But I have to pause here to say that although there's a lot of negatives to this, I think some agriculturalists would say, but there are some regions that will benefit from these changes as well. That's true, but when we're looking at a much more volatile climatic conditions, again, all farmers have to adapt. Poorer farmers with less ability to adapt have even more challenges. Recently there was a report commissioned by the CIA that was written by the National Research Council, and they examined the link between climate change and security. And this report suggests that increasing number of severe weather events and extremes can have a direct impact on populations. It also obviously puts stress on food production systems, on water supply, and can help at least contribute to creating more failed states and destabilization of regions. And I want to show you an example of this. This is not from that report, but yet from 3 researchers who've recently done a study on food crisis and political instability in the Middle East and North Africa. And where they have taken actually an overlay of an increase of violent civil unrest and compared it to increase in food prices. And so you can see that 2008, when food prices were so high, and again last year, and then also look at how the unrest, the violent civil unrest has mirrored almost those food price increases. And we certainly have seen that much of this happens in cities. Much of it happens when the price of food goes up very high in cities, and then whether in Cairo or Tunis or any other big cities or small cities, many people start gathering and start causing trouble because the base is food is too expensive. So governments compensate, and they say, okay, well, we'll make food less expensive, we'll subsidize it, or we'll do something else, and the farmer doesn't end up getting the benefit from this. But at least it calms down some of the problems in the cities. But if this is if food prices or lack of food is one of the contributions in a community where there's a lot of other issues and concerns as well, it can certainly help exacerbate it in much bigger problems, as we have seen in some of the Middle East in the last several years. Another consequence, of course, of having increased hunger is more humanitarian aid. The U.S. handles humanitarian aid extremely well, and of course I'm very biased or very neutral, as you might think. But the U.S. has for so long said this is of critical importance in our foreign policy. And in fact, remember some years ago when the U.S. said they were going to withhold dues to the UN because they didn't like certain things that the UN was doing, and so they only paid 80% of their dues. They exempted a few organizations. They always paid or contributed the full amount that they thought that they should to the World Food Program, to UNICEF, the Children's Fund, to UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, and to IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, even during the times when virtually all the other organizations were being cut. Why? Because this is helping, and the humanitarian side is very strongly part of U.S. interests. I think it always will be, and we know that when we see the generosity of Americans beyond the government during a hurricane, during a flood, right now with people in New York City, before that with Katrina, with people that were victims of the tsunami in Indonesia and elsewhere in Asia. We've seen a huge American outpouring because we want to help those people that are in great need. So that's certainly one of our strengths, but we don't want it to be the only card that we play, and we don't want it to have it be, because we didn't play any other cards, we have to put a lot more money into this area as well. Another consequence is fewer trade options for the future if farmers' incomes remain low. And especially, as I pointed out, in Africa, then we're not going to be able to build new markets. And of course, higher prices is going to put more pressure. Little disposable income to buy other goods is certainly not going to help any future trade opportunities. And as a result, over the long term, we may not have as many markets for our own products. And then most importantly, the consequence of not doing more is continued long-term poverty. And those numbers that I put up before, the 870 million people who are desperately hungry, think about that kind of poverty where people have, and hunger, where people have no food virtually, something they can scramble up, maybe the weeds from outside, maybe some small plants that they're able to grow, but not much. They can barely survive. And what happens is it is cyclical. It's generational and cyclical, because when a teenage girl gives birth, and the girl herself is undernourished, and she'll give birth to an undernourished child, and then she does not have enough milk to be able to feed this child because she can't produce enough herself because she doesn't have enough to eat herself. And the child, of course, as we know, is critically important. That in the first 1,000 days now is a new initiative. The first 1,000 days of a person's life is the most important time for her or him to be fed. In utero, as well as the first 2 years, essentially. If that child does not have adequate food, she or he is going to be stunted literally forever, stunted mentally and stunted physically. And then guess what? If she survives and she's 15 and she has a baby, it's the same cycle over and over again. So this is what we're talking about in terms of this long-term dire poverty. Now, it's important to say that this 870 million people is actually a decreased number. If we look, I don't have a chart in this presentation, but if we look at the percentages of people who are desperately poor in the 50s, for instance, and now, it's a much lower number. There's been a lot of progress, and it's primarily because of economic development. Think about South Korea, for instance, and how poor Korea was in the 50s during and after the war. And then as they developed economically, they now become a world economic power. And so the numbers of hungry people there are barely existent because of their improved worth. One interesting side note, when I was working through WFP in North Korea, trying to work on issues of dire hunger in North Korea, we were doing our own statistical analysis of how much food would be required. And essentially, it's a pretty simple formula that you take the total population, you take how much food is produced in the country, how much is imported into the country, and then you come up with a shortfall of what is left. And so when we did this calculation at the World Food Program, we checked it with others. We checked it with the calculations done by the people at USDA, for instance, about North Korea. We checked it with the people in the equivalent place in Japan about North Korea. We checked it with the Chinese statisticians about North Korea. And we all came up with roughly the same numbers. Of course, we start with the same rough number of population and rough numbers for production and for trade. But the number, when we checked with the South Koreans, the number was considerably higher. And here's the reason. A key part of that formula is the per capita daily intake. And the non-South Korea entities all use the basic standards that the international community used for that per capita daily intake. South Korea didn't use that one. They used their own. They said, we looked at what our per capita daily intake was in 1960. And in 1960, we were very poor. So we figure that's, maybe the status currently of North Korea, and so we're going to use that as our base. That number was higher than the international average number. Thus, the South Korean shortfall number for North Korea was considerably higher. But I say that to suggest that even a country which has moved considerably out of poverty can still appreciate from its own history the need for reaching to help others who are desperately hungry and poor. And between economic development and some of this kind of aid, there has been a considerable difference. Now, solution. The solution is going to be agricultural development. Steps toward increasing production of agriculture is really the only way we're going to move on to the next stage and the next step. If we have more food produced, not only are we going to be able to impact on hunger, but we're going to be able to have an impact on how the majority of the world's poor live. Because improving the agriculture sector raises the incomes of the world most vulnerable, not just those people, but others as well. For instance, the World Bank says that agricultural productivity is 2 to 4 times as effective as any other productivity in alleviating poverty. 2 to 4 times more effective than anyone else. Why? Because it has such a multiplying effect. Because we start with growing more food, we have to have more inputs to be successful in growing the food, so we buy something there, we grow the food, we sell that food, it has a nutritional impact on the people who consume that food. And sometimes if the community is sophisticated enough, it may be processed. That's another contribution to this process. If there's enough, it needs to be transported. That's another contribution. If the children are fed enough, they're more likely to go to school. It has a whole long cycle that means that agriculture development for the poor has a very significant impact. But when we think about development, though, and agriculture development, how much more can big producers produce is an open question, but I want to concentrate on the small producers, the smallholder farmers, and especially in this case in Africa, since I've talked before about the huge increases in African population. 80% of the farmers in Africa are smallholder farmers. Women do most of the work. They produce 80% of Africa's food. But when we look at the yields per ton it's a fraction, 1.2 tons, for instance, per hectare compared to 5.1 tons than it is in developed countries. It is not really mechanized, it's mostly human labor. And there's very little irrigation, especially even compared to Asia. But again, the potential for productivity and higher incomes is considerable. And there was one example in Zambia where a $1 increase in farm incomes essentially leads to another dollar gained elsewhere in the economy. Not quite of the level that the World Bank is showing, but it's almost impossible for investments in agriculture that result in increased farm incomes. It's almost impossible that those don't have a significant impact on the rest of the economy. Now, I mentioned a couple of times women and girls. Worldwide, in developing countries, they make up about 43% of the agricultural workforce. Although that number is very difficult to actually make concrete. It's the best estimate done by FAO, but much of the work by women and girls is unpaid work. And to the extent that some of these statistics are done based on paid labor, one might suggest that the number is not lower, but could in fact be higher. They do most of the work, but they lack often the same inputs, the financing or the extension. Now, FAO suggests, however, that closing the gender gap could reduce the current number of impoverished people by 100 to 150 million. What they mean is, if women had the same access to inputs as men, to fertilizer, to credit, to land ownership, and elsewhere, it's going to have a significant impact on the current number of impoverished people. There's a lot of reasons why, but they're based in large part around the role of women in the society, where women are the workers, the farmers, they're the cooks, the mothers, they take care of the children, they have to fetch the water or send their girls out to fetch the water and the firewood. They're the ones holding the family together. If the husband is off, if he's a pastoralist and he's off with the animals, if he's off looking for a job, if he's, who knows why, not there, she's taking care of the entire family. There are a lot of data that show that when income comes into the household through the woman in much of the developing world, and certainly in rural economies in the developing world, that it's much more likely to go to the betterment of the family than if it comes into the household through the man. Now, I don't want to be at all suggestive to anybody else. I see some of the men smiling in the room. But I want to give you a couple of examples. For instance, Muhammad Yunus, who you may know, Muhammad Yunus created the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, also a World Food Prize laureate and a Nobel laureate. And Muhammad tells the story of having been trained in the United States, gone back home to Bangladesh, found that people didn't have access to being able to borrow money, essentially. So people borrowed small amounts of money from money lenders and owed huge amounts of money back because of the interest that was being charged to them. So that was the genesis of his creating. He was one of the pioneers in this whole micro lending idea. So when he created the Grameen Bank, and he gave out loans that were $50, for instance, equivalent, for people who were going to invest them in something that was going to then improve their lives and their lives of their families. And he found that he asked questions. What are you going to do with the new income you have after your investment is successful? And he says that on the list of 10 things that he asked people to write down of what they were going to do with this new income, that on the list provided by the men, that maybe somewhere near the bottom of the list was something that was going to be helpful to the family. And on the list provided by the women, maybe at the bottom of the list there was something that was going to be personal for herself. So that was one thing that was very important to him in terms of knowing the social benefits of what he was going to do in terms of lending to men and to women. But the other thing that was important to him was the return rate and the payback rate for the loans. because women paid back 98 or 99% of the loans, and the male rate was much lower. So for business reasons and social impact reasons, he ended up mostly, not exclusively, but mostly lending to women. And it's just one example to underscore my point about women and money going to women, inputs going to women. So often when I was traveling with the World Food Program, whether I was in Latin America, Asia, Middle East, South America, or Sub-Saharan Africa, women would say to me, you know, the food that WFP is sending is so important to our household, and some people, and please keep sending me food, please don't send cash, because when cash comes to the household, then I don't have control over it, and then it could go for a lot of different things because my husband decides what to do with it. But if food comes into the household, I'm in charge. So again, another example. But part of the solution issue goes a few steps further, because it's easy to talk about the role of women and girls, but what do we do about it? How do we get women to be more involved, more engaged? They're not in school as often as the boys are. They're not as literate as the men are. And we all know that if a farmer can count and can read, that she or he is going to be more successful than one who can't. So we also know from research that women are more likely to follow other women farmers. So if they see a successful woman, they're much more likely to say, oh, how's she doing that, than to see a successful man and try to figure out how to replicate what he's doing. So all of this is to say that we have to find different ways to reach women. I mean, of course, the basic is to educate girls and women, but if we're just talking about the farming inputs, how can we get information to the woman who's farming? How can we be sure that she ends up with a cell phone as well as her husband ending up with a cell phone, so that she can look up what the prices are, and assuming she can read, and other things that are important for her to know about what she's going to do with selling what she has grown. But thinking about this from her perspective is extremely important. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Current efforts. Now I'm starting here with President Obama, because he said in his inaugural address 4 years ago, and just reading the beginning of this, to the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you to make your farms flourish and clean waters flow. Why is that important? Because the U.S. and the other donor governments around the world really had forgotten about agriculture development. Up until it used to be a fairly strong part of our foreign policy up until the early 80s. And then so many other priorities came its way that supporting agriculture in the developing world just became much, much less important. And I said to a group earlier today, if I go through Africa and I meet a person who has been in agriculture who's my generation and who's succeeded in agriculture in Africa, it's very likely that he was trained in the U.S. at a U.S. land-grant university. But not now. If I meet a 35-year-old in Africa now, it's much more likely that he was trained in China than in the United States. We just don't do that so much anymore. We just don't do this kind of outreach. We had, until a few years ago, almost no Peace Corps volunteers that we had a high priority for agriculture. We had almost no infrastructure at USDA to do agriculture. So I know recently some of you heard Dan Glickman and Clayton Yiter and Jack Block and Mike Johans speak at one of these lectures. And Dan Glickman and I are the Bi-Partisan co-chairs of an effort to try to raise this issue of agriculture development within the U.S. government. So in 2008, we marketed a plan to or an argument to do this to the McCain people and to the Obama people. And then as soon as Obama was elected, we went to see their folks to say, you really have to do this, you really have to do this. Now, how much influence we had on this getting in his speech, I don't know, but we do know that the administration now, for the first time in a long time, decided, yes, it's a good idea to put more effort into agriculture development. And one of the things that they did was create a program called Feed the Future, which is at USAID. Also, the U.S. brought to the G8 summit in 2009 the idea, let's all of us wealthy countries, let's get into the business again of helping agriculture development. There was a $22 billion commitment. I hesitate to suggest that it was all that commitment was met, because I think it's a fairly low percentage, but they're still working at getting support from these countries about how to focus on agriculture development, but they basically agreed to do that. And so far, so this slide lists some of the pluses of some of the new things that have happened as a result. Excuse me. Also, it was announced in May that there's a new alliance for food security and nutrition, and it links commitments made by African leaders to strengthen their food security strategies with private sector from this country, from Europe, and from Africa, and from elsewhere. And so a fair amount has been pledged so far from different multilateral companies to do more work in this new alliance, particularly in Africa. And there are about 8 African countries who now have over 10% of their budgets spent on agriculture, and they've created collectively a goal to spend at least 10% of their own budgets on agriculture. And another new thing gets back to gender programming, and so for the first time USAID has a program that's going to try to actually assess how well the US is doing in reducing the disparity of resources between women and men. And just let me tell you just a couple of very quick examples of why this is important. When I visited once Angola, right after a particular area of Angola had been demined, and we talked to farmers there who were going to go back into the fields. And the women farmers were in one group, and the men were in another group. And the women were all complaining. They said, we can't go back in the field because we don't have any hoes. Hose. Now, in Nebraska, I don't have to spell hose. In New York City once, I had to spell it. So I said, well, what are all those over there? Because along the side of the fence, there were all sorts of things that looked like hose to me. They were very long wooden poles meeting a kind of a rectangular spade on a 90-degree angle. Looked like a hoe to me. I said, well, what's wrong with all of those? They said those are male hose. Well, did anybody know there's a gender differentiation in hose? I didn't. So, well, okay, the next question is, what's a female hoe? Well, it's a shorter pole with a kind of shovel-like spade, pointed spade that meets at maybe a 50-degree angle. And in order to use it, you don't stand, you use the male hoe almost like a rake, right? You lean over like this and do this. In order to use the female hoe, you have to squat. And it digs further into the ground. So, okay, why? What's the difference? Guess what? Most of these women work with babies on their backs all day. And it was less backbreaking to be like this than it was to stand up and bend over. Who knew? We didn't know. We knew they needed hoes. Nobody had talked to the women about what that meant, what those hoes were. When we sent food to Rwandese refugees in then Zaire, we sent hard-kerneled corn. Nobody talked to the women who are going to be cooking it, and it takes 3 times as long to cook that hard-kerneled corn as it did if we had milled it before we sent it to them. So that meant that they needed 3 times as much water and firewood, which meant as refugees, they had to go away, out in more unsafe places for longer periods of time in order to be able to grow that, to cook that food. And then finally, when I was with the Gates Foundation, they were funding a Canadian NGO that was working on using radio stations in Africa for extension purposes. So one example is a radio station in rural Ghana, where it had been decided by polling the community that they were going to put programming on this radio station to teach people how to grow tomatoes. Tomatoes, not indigenous community, but would be very good for the nutritional well-being of people. So, and of course, women were going to be the farmers for the new tomatoes, new crops. So they developed the half-an-hour, once-a-week show about tomatoes. But they did one other very important thing. They surveyed households where they knew already everybody virtually had a radio. But they surveyed about when do you listen to the radio? When does the lady listen to the radio? When does the man listen to the radio? And if it's, because they got to put this on when the woman's going to listen to it, right? I mean, because she's going to be the farmer. And what happens, they further asked, if the husband and the wife both listen to the radio at the same time? Who controls the knob? Sound familiar? You know what, if you didn't get this right, you were going to waste all of this money. And that's part of the issue. We've been wasting a lot of money in agriculture development because we haven't paid attention to who's using it. So the little bit of money we have spent, we haven't concentrated on, on what the needs are of the farmers, women, men, boys, girls, and what actually they need. Now, to continue what we're doing in the US now, this is really bipartisan. It's not, I don't want to start with the president and have you think it's only an idea for Democrats to do. No, it's never been the case in this country, never. It's always been a bipartisan approach. And in fact, one of the several really important things that George W. Bush did was create the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which then was further approved by Congress in order to help strengthen infrastructure in many countries. And although they had some glitches getting started, most people say they're really doing pretty well. In this concept. And then Senator Lugar, who's unfortunately finishing his Senate term soon from Indiana, and Senator Casey, a Republican and a Democrat, introduced the Global Food Security Act in 2009 because they wanted to say that the law should say that U.S. development assistance should focus on hunger alleviation and we should work on these kind of programs and the administration should be committed to doing it. Well, this administration was committed to doing it, but what these folks wanted was to say the law should say that, so it's not dependent on whether or not one administration is going to do it or one wasn't. It passed from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on which Senator Lugar sat, and it didn't go any further. As I said, this is bipartisan. Senator Graham from South Carolina has been very outspoken about the need to help farmers and to help feed people and sustain people in Africa, and as has people like a Democratic congressman from my own state. Oh, it says California. What a terrible typo. She's from New York, who talking about how important some of these issues are in the future. But so what's necessary is in Congress is to lift the priority for these issues. I mean, think about Congress. They haven't even passed the Farm Bill yet. But if they could make a long-term commitment to poor farmers by codifying this into law, by doing something like the Global Food Security Act. In fact, I think they should name it the Lugar Global Food Security Act, in deference to all his great work in this area. But this could go a long way to be ensuring that the U.S. government prioritizes this in the future. There are a lot of other things that Congress can do also to improve on the edges some of these issues as well. We need more champions. Here, look at this old picture of George McGovern and Bob Dole. I mean, they were really a team. George has just recently passed away, and Bob is still fighting as George was until his last days. But they did a lot together in a bipartisan manner, and they were really champions of domestic and international food and agriculture programs. And Senator Johans, of course, having been in Agriculture Secretary, is making his mark. I mentioned a couple others on the House side, Jim McGovern, who's a Democrat, and Joanne Emerson from Missouri, who's a Republican, who have made a mark. But we need to develop more people to be really strong. And by the way, Jim McGovern, who's, I don't know, maybe 45 or 50, spoke at George McGovern's funeral and told a story saying that he's no relation, but nobody believes that. So all the time, wherever he goes, people say, "Oh, I had great admiration for your father," and he said, "Well, I really appreciate that." And they said, "Yeah, we're big supporters of your father." And he'd say, "Oh, that's great. Well, I'm sure that his liquor store appreciates your support. Please keep going there." But he continues this effort. But ultimately, when we think about the message we're sending to Congress, we want to kind of change the way even they're thinking about this. And all of us are thinking about it because we've been leading with food aid. And we want to say, yes, food aid is important, but food aid is important when we can't, because we haven't been able to get enough people out of poverty and be able to have access to their own food. So let's go into leading with food security and ultimately using all of these tools to end hunger. In order to do that, we also have to get, I think, more serious about trade. Agriculture is such a critical part of our trade portfolio. It's absolutely critically important, but we could be much more progressive in working on trade issues and on working on systems that are more based on market-based agriculture. And including, I've put in eliminating the mandate for the biofuels at the pump. I think in any sort of a real discussion of trade issues, this is going to come up over and over again, as it does in many different contexts about feeding people. And then also we should put in our own direction to our own ambassadors around the world to work with countries on their issues, on reducing their trade inefficiency, on their checkpoints, on their transportation costs, on increasing their efficiency, all important as well. Can't talk about this topic without talking about agriculture research and also about the land-grant universities around the country. Our commitment as a country to supporting agriculture research has slowed. Support for innovation is critically important as we continue, and we really should be doing much more as a country to build on the excellence of the U.S. land-grant system and all the things that are available there. Look for a minute at what some other countries are doing. China has increased its public agriculture research spending. It's doubled it just from 2000 to 2008. Brazil's budget has increased 20% in 11 years. And the productivity in China grew 136%, Brazil 176%, compared to an average of an 82% growth in the developing countries. And then if we look at U.S. productivity growth, our rates are half of what they were from 50 to 1989. And as the president of IFAD says, there's no coincidence that in countries where agriculture has taken off, there have been large investments in research and in infrastructure. And we certainly have had that in the past. We need to do more in the future. We have so many comparative advantages. We have the advantage of research, the advantage of technology, the advantage of our great university land-grant system, the development experience that we've had, the farming expertise. And so we have so many opportunities to extend U.S. goodwill and strengthen our international standing using these kind of things as some of our soft power, as some of our ways to help countries work their way out of poverty. You know, this is a U.S. interest. It's an interest for commercial purposes. I talked about trade options before. It's an interest for political purposes in terms of our presenting ourselves in this way around the world. It's certainly an interest for us as human beings and our moral responsibility to help people who are in great need in ways that we can help using our own expertise to help them. And finally, it's become a security issue. And if any one of these reasons about U.S. interests are enough reason to invest in agriculture development and prioritize it, but security is becoming more and more of a compelling reason to do so. You know, in John Kennedy's time, he said his vision was to put a man on the moon. Our vision could very easily be end hunger in our lifetimes. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
So we have time for some questions from the floor. I believe we have folks, Jill Brown down here, there are mics up on the upper deck as well. So if you have a question, they'll bring the mic to you. So are there questions from the floor for Catherine? right over here.
Well, thank you very much for a stimulating talk. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about, you talked about innovation.
About what?
Innovation and the importance of R&D and all those. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the importance of innovation policy? I'm thinking about intellectual property rights that are needed to induce innovation by the private sector and at the same time can raise prices and affect the access of hunger-stricken communities to food. So.
Okay, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the mic is. Could you hear? Because I'm not sure I'm hearing. Very
Dinos,
well.
can you repeat your question?
So I'm talking about. I'm thinking about your thoughts on the role of innovation policy, intellectual property rights, patents, how this can affect. They are necessary to induce innovation especially by the private sector, but at the same time can create access problems and increased prices of food.
Yeah.
How do you balance those in terms of US in terms of policy?
Okay, yeah, there's all different directions to go from that sense. So let me just pick up a few different examples. One is seeds and seed development, for example. Many countries in the developing world have prohibitions against bringing in seed, any kind of seeds, but seeds unless they're grown not only in their country, but by the government entities in their country, and it really severely restricts the possibilities for those farmers to be able to develop. So that's one of the things that would be on the list that I mentioned for what our ambassadors should do when they try to work with governments to change their own policies. Is that's the kind of thing that would be on that example, and that doesn't even get into bringing seeds in from other countries as well, and it doesn't even deal with the issue of genetically modified. But then if we go that next step, then we've got a whole range of issues too, not only the ownership issues as we know of them here, but also the usage issues. And so many of the countries in Africa, for instance, are concerned about using seeds from the outside, concerned that any of their fledgling European markets would dry up because of it. So there's a delicate balance of who's going to own. And then there are other entities that are working with some of the big companies in the U.S. on these issues to be able to try to find ways for them to continue to own the rights to their product essentially, but yet not set up the same systems that are set up in this country in order to use them. So there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes activity on that, but I think the biggest first step has got to be to open up the laws in many countries just to allow for an expansion of seeds, for example, but it falls into other products as well.
I think we have a question from Marjorie Kostelnik.
Hi. Often when we see programs that provide funding for women farmers, we see them in other countries or developing countries. Would there be any benefit in having those kinds of programs, maybe not the size of them, but those types of programs here in the United States?
To help women farmers in the U.S., is that?
That you got it. Yes.
The first thing I think we should do, gentlemen, bear with me here, is to redefine in our own minds when you say the word farmer and you associate a picture with that in your mind, what do you think of? And somehow I'd like to change that. You know, I mean, dig into the internet and when you put in farmer and you want a picture, get the picture of a woman in there somewhere, maybe even a lot. Because again, around the world, women are such critical figures in the whole agricultural industry, as they are here and often overlooked, again, as the people holding everything together, if not actually doing the farming themselves. But I don't have any ideas right off hand for how to deal with this issue directly, except to say that one of the important things we could do is to find ways to get more girls into the sciences and more girls into agriculture schools. I was looking at your statistics, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was like 30-something% female here, undergraduate agriculture, and whatever, 70, it was 30-some% women, I think. Does everybody remember that? So if we are able to move in more women in this, or more girls in the sciences in high school, perhaps we could get more through the system.
And I realize that there are many women in agriculture and ranching today, so I'm not ignoring that. But I am thinking about the fact that very often in farming and ranching, there's a legacy to this. And it is, when we look to see who are the farmers and ranchers of tomorrow, they are often people that's part of their family.
Right.
And I guess I'm thinking particularly about urban environments and how we attract new people to farming and ranching. And it seems to me that a possibility might be some seed dollars or some approach to women in those environments to consider agriculture or some aspect of agriculture in their future.
Sure, sure. Something worth discussing, yes.
Well, thank you for your talk and all the suggestions of what our government can do. But as an individual, do you have any suggestions as far as what we can do? Are programs like Heifer International and those organizations valuable to contribute to help with the problem of ending poverty and hunger?
Sure. I'd like to give you several examples of what you can do. One is there's an organization called Students Fighting Hunger. It is based out of Auburn University. And they created it at first as an Auburn organization, but then they expanded it nationally and even internationally. They have a committee of one student from each of their different schools within the university. That's the executive board, and then each of those students works with the schools, whatever, agriculture, communication, engineering, whatever, and then gets each of them involved in their own ways to work on projects working against hunger. So I'd connect to them on the internet, and that might be a wonderful thing to bring to Nebraska if it's not here already. Second is that, yes, there are many different NGOs. You mentioned Heifer International. Heifer is wonderful, but I give one caveat if you contribute to Heifer, and they know I say this because I agitate them about this, that if you give to them, put on the contribution, I want the title to these animals to go to women. And I'll tell you why, because most cases women are the ones that are taking care of the animals, but if the title is not in her name, she has no control over when the animal is sold and what the use is of the money afterwards. And I've certainly seen examples, for instance, of a woman who is taking care of a dairy cow every day, and she goes to the field to work in the field, and she takes the cow and the little children, and they're all in the field, the cow's grazing. Oh, she milks the cow first before she goes. She brings the milk to the co-op. Then they go to the field. Then they come back. She milks the cow again, brings the milk to the co-op. And then once a week, it's time to get the check from the co-op. But guess what? That's not the trip that she makes to the co-op. That's the trip her husband makes to the co-op because it's his cow. So I say, if you're going to give animals, say we want the title to be for women. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. There are, of course, a lot of other NGOs that are useful and helpful, and for not just students in the room, but for anybody looking for a new adventure. There is still the Peace Corps. And I've, when you talk to anybody here who's a returned Peace Corps volunteer, is it high on your list of things you've done in your life? Yes. Yes. See, I've never met a Peace Corps volunteer who doesn't say it's the best thing I ever did. It's still the best thing, and you can go whether you're just out of college or just into retirement, and they accept. So those are certainly opportunities. If you're a student and you're thinking about going into the UN, get a graduate degree and have a language, and then find some experience. So those are ways to do it. And then I have to come back to what the government can do, because that starts with you. So write to your senators. You have a brand new senator, right? So make sure right up front she knows about how important these issues are, and as well as others.
We'll take one more question, but before we do that, the gentleman that just introduced himself is Dr. Mark Doyle. who is our new Director of Global Engagement here for the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources. So Mark, good to have you here. Marilyn?
Yes, you started your talk with a slide about obesity, and the obesity, which is not only a United States problem, but a world problem. What role do you see agriculture playing in helping solve that, both in the United States and in the developing world?
Agriculture has to be, the major purpose for agriculture is to grow food that we eat, that we consume. And there's one of the big disconnects is between agriculture and health, with nutrition in between. And from a policy perspective, there can be a lot more done in order to connect the two, and how, you know, how food is healthy and what people need to be healthy. And of course, that brings us back to nutrition in between. But it's also compartmentalized, and in policy as well as in bureaucracy. So I think that one important thing is to work on that issue. Then there's individual things that can be done. Like, for instance, I know that the Secretary of Agriculture has recently put out new guidelines for school lunches, and a lot of people are complaining about these new guidelines. But they were all done in an effort, as I understand it, to try to deal with the obesity issue, especially as it relates to children in school. But you know, lots of people are complaining about them. But if you think they're good, it'd be helpful to say so, because there's people that don't think they're good are certainly pushing in the other direction. But the big thing is, I think, that we have to do a lot more to connect the two, and it's very stovepiped, as well as in developing countries. You know, you talk to the agriculture ministry here, and you talk to the health ministry here, and that's something that I think collectively we have to work on to have better communications.
Kathy, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative here for a minute and ask you one last question. I had the opportunity to sit in a think tank that Catherine and Dan Glickman led during the World Food Prize event in Des Moines a few weeks ago on behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that Catherine talked about today. And you mentioned the 2008 effort and the white paper that was prepared for the incoming administration, the Feed the Future initiative. That came out of that. Can you talk any about what the thinking is on this current group and what they're working on at this point? Sure.
Well, what we did in 08 and 09 was essentially make the argument for prioritizing agriculture development, which essentially the administration has done. So now the argument is what's next, and a lot of what's next are the science and technology issues, the building on the land grant university expertise levels, and continuing to find ways to bring in the private sector and make these connections between governments and the private sector. And a lot of people don't think, especially in some of the areas in which we work, they don't necessarily think about agriculture as a business. It's a constant business. And it's a big business for many farmers in Nebraska, but for a woman with a hectare of land that she's trying to farm, it's a business for her too. But but it's not necessarily thought about that way from a policy perspective. So we want to make better connections also between the private sector, the R&D, and further kind of next steps of what's absolutely required in order to push this movement further, and that's where we hope to be headed in the future when we finish our next white paper soon.
Well, please join me in thanking Catherine for a wonderful lecture. When we started the Hierman Lectures, we commissioned a medal to give to each Hierman lecturer to help them remember coming to the University of Nebraska and sharing their time with us. And I think there's a picture of it on the screen somewhere, hopefully, but maybe not. So Catherine, we thank you so much for coming to Nebraska. I know she wanted T-shirts and pins, so we're sending her home with a lot of Husker paraphernalia. But we're also sending her home with a beautiful medal that captures the essence of the lecture series of food security, renewable energy security, natural resource security. So thank you so much for being our lecturer.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
In closing, I'd bring your attention to the November 30th lecture that had been planned in jointly with the Yider Scholars. We've had to cancel that lecture. Kim Anderson from the University of Adelaide has had a scheduling problem with another committee he's been asked to be on for the Australian government and cannot be here that date. But I will draw your attention to January the 15th, which will be the evening of our next Human lecture. Our lecturer will be Dr. Temple Grandin, who many of you will recognize the name of as an international authority on animal behavior and also in autism, being a high-functioning autistic herself. Temple's a longtime friend, was a faculty member with her at Colorado State in the Animal Sciences Department. You might recall the HBO series about her life here in the last few years. So we're really looking forward to having Temple on our campus, marked January the 15th for her lecture. It'll be in the evening. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you for being here.